The newspaper said the enemy was caught, that justice was done. But Freddy knew better. His real enemy wasn't in a jail cell. It was inside his own head. The memory of those 21 days, a memory that no security team, no steel wall could ever lock out. How do you win a war when the enemy is your own mind? That enemy, that memory, was the price he paid for the name. Heineken. Today we see an empire. But in 1864, that name belonged to just a 22-year-old kid named Gerard Adrian Heineken, walking through Amsterdam, utterly disgusted by the beer. Back then, the city ran on a dark, heavy, inconsistent sludge. It wasn't a craft. It was a gamble every time you ordered a glass. Gerard didn't just buy a brewery, he bought a laboratory. He gambled everything on a new scientific German technique called lager, isolating a single pure A yeast to guarantee that every bottle tasted exactly the same. It was the first act of total control. The family business grew, survived world wars and prohibition, but it was his grandson, Freddy Heineken, who perfected that control and turned it into a global pop culture icon. Taking charge in 1971, Freddy wasn't a brewer. He was a marketing genius and a ruthless showman. He was the man who ordered the E's in Heineken to be tilted to make them smile. He insisted on the iconic green bottle. He acquired his main rival, Amstel, not just to compete, but to dominate. By 1983, he wasn't just a CEO. He was Mr. Heineken, a charismatic, untouchable king who was personal friends with the Dutch royal family. He was the living symbol of that 100-year-old obsession with control. But in 1983, kings were becoming targets. The Amsterdam that Freddy Heineken ruled over was a city of stark, violent contrasts. Alongside the glittering wealth of the canal house elite, there was a dark underbelly. The 1970s and early 80s were a time of deep economic recession, soaring unemployment, and massive social unrest. The Quakers beweeging, the squatters movement, had turned parts of the city into virtual war zones, with pitched battles between activists and police. In the poorer working-class districts like the Jordan, a generation of disaffected young men was coming of age. They had no jobs, no prospects, and a deep burning resentment for the establishment that Freddy Heineken so perfectly represented. They saw the yachts, the mansions, the endless river of money that flowed from those green bottles, and they felt locked out. For a small group of childhood friends from this world, that resentment began to curdle into a dark and incredibly audacious idea. They were not, it must be said, criminal masterminds. Not yet. They were small-time hoods. Their leader was Cor van Hout. He was a carpenter by trade, a builder. He was smart, meticulous, and simmering with a personal vendetta against a system he felt had wronged his family. With him was his brother-in-law, a young man named Willem Holleder. Holleder was the muscle, but he was also possessed of a chilling, manipulative charisma. He was, though few knew it yet, a budding psychopath. Rounding out the core group were Jan Beulard, another builder whose skills would be indispensable, and Franz Meyer, known as the worrier of the group. They had done a few armed robberies, a bank here, a payroll snatch there, but they were small-time. They were ambitious. They wanted to pull off one last spectacular job, the jackpot that would set them up for life. They didn't want to rob a bank vault. They wanted to rob the bank itself. They wanted to steal the nation's greatest prize. They decided to kidnap Freddy Heineken. This was not a snatch and grab. This was a 2-year, meticulously planned military operation. Their patience was terrifying. For 2 full years, they watched Freddy Heineken. They learned his routine. They knew he was a man of habit, a fatal flaw for a man of his stature. They knew he left his office on the Wettering Plantzone in Amsterdam at the same time almost every evening. They knew he was driven in his company Mercedes by his loyal, long-time chauffeur, a 57-year-old man named Ab Doderer. Doderer was not part of the plan. He was just a working man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would become the tragic collateral damage. The gang read everything they could on kidnapping. They allegedly studied manuals used by terrorist groups like the Red Army faction. They learned about police procedure, about negotiation tactics, about how to avoid surveillance. They stole a fleet of getaway cars, repainting them, fitting them with false number plates, and stashing them in lockups around the city. They assembled an arsenal of weapons, Uzis, handguns, shotguns, to ensure maximum intimidation. But their most chilling preparation, the detail that reveals the cold, calculated cruelty of their plan, was the prison. Using Cor van Hout and Jan Bullard's construction skills, they scouted a warehouse in the Westpoort, a desolate industrial park on the western edge of Amsterdam. Inside a large, nondescript storage shed, they built a secret. Behind a false wall, they constructed 2 holding cells. These were not rooms, they were boxes, tiny, just a few square meters each, and they were soundproof. They were lined with acoustic foam designed to be sensory deprivation chambers. There was no light, no sound, no day, no night. Each cell contained only a bunk bed, a chemical toilet, and a heavy-duty chain bolted to the floor. They were purpose-built tombs for the living. They stocked them with supplies, food, and water, preparing for a long, patient siege. Finally, they planned the ransom. They settled on an astronomical sum, the largest in Dutch history, 35 million guilders. Today, that's roughly 16 million euros, or about $20 million at the time, an amount so vast they believed the company would have no choice but to pay. To make it harder to trace, they demanded it in 4 different currencies: Dutch guilders, US dollars, German marks, and French francs. They prepared their communication plan, coded messages to be placed in the personal columns of a national newspaper. They recorded cassette tapes with their disguised voices. They bought walkie-talkies for the ransom drop. By early November 1983, every piece was in place. The cars were stolen. The weapons were loaded. The prison was built. The trap was set. All they had to do was wait for the king to walk into it. It was a Wednesday, a cold, damp, and utterly ordinary November evening in Amsterdam. Just after 6:30 p.m., Freddy Heineken, now 60 years old, walked out of his office. He was a creature of habit, a man who believed in his own invincibility, a man who, despite his immense wealth, often eschewed heavy security. With him was his trusted chauffeur, 57-year-old Ab Doderer. They settled into the company Mercedes, the soft click of their seatbelts echoing the thousands of other times they had made this exact journey. The wipers clicked on, clearing the mist from the windscreen. They pulled away from the curb, merging into the evening traffic, and that's when the world ended. In a split second, a blue Volkswagen delivery van, which had been parked just up the street, roared to life and swerved, cutting them off with a screech of tires. Simultaneously, a red Opel, which had been tailing them, slammed to a halt behind them, boxing them in. It was a perfect, brutal trap. Before Freddy or Ab could even process what was happening, the doors of the van burst open. 4 men disguised in masks and boiler suits leapt out. They were armed with what looked like machine guns. They were later found to be Uzi replicas. But in that moment of pure terror, the distinction was meaningless. They swarmed the Mercedes. Ab Doderer, reacting on pure instinct, jammed the car into reverse, but the Opel was right on his bumper. He was trapped. One of the men smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his gun, the glass exploding inwards, showering Doderer. They yanked his door open. Another man was at Freddy's passenger door. In that first moment of chaos, the famous Heineken bravado, the arrogance of a man who ruled the world, took over. As a gun was shoved in his face, Freddy reportedly snapped, "What is this, a joke? Do you know who I am?" The response was a brutal, silencing blow. There was no negotiation, no discussion. He and Doderer were pistol whipped, the cold metal cracking against their skulls. They were stunned, bleeding, and dragged from the luxury of their car onto the cold, wet pavement. Witnesses, frozen in disbelief, would later recall the sheer speed and animalistic violence of the attack. They were shoved, thrown, into the dark, cavernous back of the van. The doors slammed shut, plunging them into total darkness. The van fishtailed, its tires smoking, and vanished into the night. Left behind on the quiet, respectable Wettering Plantsoen was a smashed, empty Mercedes, its hazards blinking uselessly in the rain, and on the pavement, a small dark pool of blood. The king was gone. Inside the van, they were blindfolded, their hands bound with plastic cuffs. The drive was a disorienting blur, lasting maybe 45 minutes, though it must have felt like an eternity. When the van finally stopped, they were pulled out, shoved into a building, and led down a corridor. Then, the most disorienting part, they were forced to walk through what felt like a heavy, padded, coffin-like door. The blindfolds were ripped off, and the true, calculated horror of their new reality set in. They were not in a damp basement. They were in the purpose-built prison the gang had spent months constructing. They were separated, each man shoved into his own tiny, soundproof cell. The world, for Freddy Heineken, had just shrunk to a box measuring 2 by 2.5 meters. This was the core of the kidnapper's psychological warfare. It wasn't just imprisonment, it was entombment. The walls were thick, lined with acoustic foam, muffling every sound from the outside world. There was no day. There was no night. There was only the constant, maddening hum of an extractor fan and the glare of a single bare light bulb that was never, ever turned off. Freddy and Ab were chained to the wall by a heavy ankle cuff. The chain was just long enough to reach the single bunk bed and the chemical toilet in the corner. For Freddy Heineken, a man who controlled a global empire from his yacht, who commanded boardrooms, who could fly anywhere in the world on a whim, this was a special kind of hell. He was a man defined by his power, his freedom, and his control. And in an instant, he had been stripped of all three. He was quite literally a dog on a chain. Next door, in an identical box, was Ab Doderer, and his terror was perhaps even more profound. He was not a wealthy tycoon. He was not a king. He was just a driver, a working man, a loyal employee who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been kidnapped for no other reason than he was sitting next to the target. He had no empire to think about, no grand strategy for survival. He was just a man, terrified for his life, and he, by all accounts, began to crumble. The two men could not see each other. They couldn't hear each other. But in the crushing silence, they discovered a fragile human connection. They began to tap, a tap on the wall, a tap back. It was a primitive, desperate code, a simple reassurance in the shared darkness. You are not alone. I am still here. Their captors were phantoms. They wore balaclavas and overalls, disguising their voices to be high-pitched and squeaky. They never spoke. They delivered food, simple meals, bread, cheese, sometimes a hot meal from a local takeaway, incongruously served on paper plates, by sliding it through a small locked hatch. This is where the character of Freddy Heineken truly revealed itself. He was 60 years old. He was injured. He was terrified. But he was not broken. He was a fighter. He was a negotiator. And even in this box, he began to fight back in the only way he knew how. He began to test his captors. He would later recount how he complained. He complained about the food. He famously griped that his breakfast egg was boiled too hard. He, Freddy Heineken, preferred a 4-minute egg. It was an act of pure, magnificent defiance. It was his way of saying, I am not just a piece of cargo. I am a person, and you are my service staff. He demanded his own brand of cigars, and in a bizarre psychological victory, they gave them to him. They would shove the cigars through the hatch. He was testing them, studying them, trying to find a human crack, a weakness, any sign of amateurism he could exploit. He was also, in his own mind, processing the event with a chilling detachment. He would later make a famous psychologically telling remark. They didn't kidnap me, he said. They kidnapped Mr. Heineken. It was a classic defense mechanism. He was separating himself, Freddy the man, from the public symbol, the asset that these men wanted. It was the only way his mind could cope with the absolute violation of being treated as merchandise, a 35 million guilder product. While Freddy and Ab languished in their soundproof tombs, the outside world was in absolute chaos. The news of the kidnapping hit the Netherlands like a bomb. It was unthinkable. This wasn't Italy with its Red Brigades or South America. This was stable, orderly, safe Amsterdam. The king had been snatched from his castle. A sense of national vulnerability set in. A massive police task force was assembled, the largest in Dutch history. They codenamed the investigation Operation Lagos, a wry nod to one of Heineken's most successful international brands. They tapped thousands of phone lines. They interviewed hundreds of informants. They chased down every lead, from disgruntled ex-employees to organized crime figures. But they were flying completely blind. The gang had been too meticulous. They had left no trail. The Heineken family was plunged into a nightmare. Freddy's wife, Lucille, and his 29-year-old daughter, Charlene, were secluded in their Nordwijk villa, now a fortress guarded by heavily armed police. The company's board, shocked into action, took charge. Freddy's son-in-law, Dries van der Vossen, became the family's public-facing negotiator. The weight of saving Freddy Heineken now rested on his shoulders. 2 days after the abduction, the first communication arrived. It was a package left at a designated spot. Inside was a cassette tape. On it, the voice of Freddy Heineken, thin, reedy, but unmistakably his. He was reading a statement prepared by his captors, proof that he and Ab Dotterer were still alive. And then came the demand. A letter, pieced together from cut-out newspaper letters, like something from a movie. It demanded 35 million guilders. The sum was staggering, but the letter also contained a chilling threat, a line that would become the motto of the entire ordeal. Do not involve the police, it warned, or the eagle will not land. The eagles, of course, was Freddy, but the police were already involved, and so began a torturous, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The negotiation was a surreal 1980s techno-thriller. The kidnappers, paranoid about phone taps, refused to talk. They communicated through coded advertisements placed in the personal columns of De Telegraaf, a national newspaper. The police and family, playing along, would reply in kind. The entire nation watched, gripped, as these bizarre, cryptic messages appeared. The hare is running, one ad from the kidnappers might read. The family would reply, the meadow is green. It was a public and deeply frustrating spectacle. The police were desperate for a direct line, a mistake, a slip-up. But the gang, despite being amateurs, were disciplined. Inside the police task force, the strain was immense. They were getting nowhere. They had a near miss when an anonymous tip led them to a bar frequented by Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder. They put the bar under surveillance, but the gang, spooked by the slightest change in atmosphere, never showed. They were like ghosts. For the family, the waiting was an agony. Days turned into a week turned into 2. Freddy had now been gone for 19 days. The fear was no longer just if they'd get him back, but in what condition. They decided they had to pay. The risk was too great. The sheer logistics of the ransom were mind-boggling. The company had to gather 35 million guilders in cash in 4 different currencies. The US dollar bills alone had to be sourced from banks all over Europe. The final package, weighing over 200 kilograms, that's 440 pounds, was packed into 24 heavy, reinforced mailbags. On the night of Monday, November 28th, the drop was set in motion. Dries van der Vossen was instructed to drive alone. He was a brave man, but he must have been terrified. He was sent on a wild goose chase across the Netherlands, a tactic designed to shake any police tail. The kidnapper's final instruction was pure, paranoid genius. They directed him to stop at a specific remote phone booth. Inside, a walkie-talkie was waiting for him. They would guide him by radio, a line that couldn't be traced back to a physical location. They guided him, his voice tense, to a viaduct on a motorway near Utrecht. The instructions were precise. At a specific marker, he was to slow down, but not stop. He was to heave the 24 mailbags one by one over the side of the bridge. Imagine the scene. A lone man on a dark windswept motorway throwing 200 kilograms of money into the blackness below. He was, in fact, not quite alone. A police officer was hidden in the back of his car just in case. Together they wrestled the bags over the railing. They tumbled down into the darkness, landing on a quiet slip road below. Down in that darkness, the kidnapper's van was waiting. They snatched the bags, hauled them in, and sped away. They had done it. They had the money. They had pulled off the perfect crime. A wave of profound, exhausted relief washed over the family and the police. It was done. The money was paid. Now all they had to do was wait for Freddy and Ab to be released. 1 day passed. Nothing. 2 days passed. Silence. A new cold dread began to set in. A dread far worse than before. They had the money. So where were they? Had they been double-crossed? Had the kidnappers taken the money and finished the job? The family began to spiral into despair. What they didn't know was that the kidnappers were panicking. They had the 35 million guilders, but the plan, which had been so perfect, had no clear endgame. They were 5 young men sitting on a mountain of cash, and they were terrified. They were arguing. What next? How do they release them without getting caught? And then the police got a break, not from the ransom, but from a separate anonymous tip. The source is still debated to this day. Some say it was a rival criminal, others a panicked associate. But the tip was good. It pointed them to the Westport Industrial Park. It pointed them to the warehouse. The police net, which had been cast so wide, was suddenly, coincidentally, tightening. The kidnappers felt it. They knew the police were close. It was time to get out. On the evening of Wednesday, November 30th, 21 days after the abduction, the gang made their final panicked move. They burst into the cells. They unchained Freddy and Ab, who were blindfolded, disoriented, and had no idea what was happening. Was this the release or the execution? They were shoved into a van and driven to a different industrial area. They were led into a different empty shed. And in a final act of cruel, cowardly convenience, the kidnappers chained both men to a concrete pillar. Then they made an anonymous call to the police, tipping them off to this new location, and they vanished. Police cars swarmed the location. Officers burst in, guns drawn, expecting a shootout, and there they were. In the beam of a flashlight, they saw two men huddled, freezing, and terrified. They were bearded, they were filthy, they were blinking in the light, but they were alive. The first images of Freddy Heineken wrapped in a thick blanket, being led to safety by police officers, were broadcast around the world. He looked dazed, frail, aged a decade in 3 weeks. But as he was helped into a police car, a reporter shoved a microphone in his face and shouted, "Mr. Heineken, are you all right?" Freddy, in a moment of pure, undiluted shock, grit, and brand manager instinct, managed to summon a flash of his old self. He looked at the reporter, and in a hoarse voice he grunted, "As long as my beer is all right, I'm all right." The ordeal was over. The 21 days were done. But for Freddy Heineken, for Ab Dotterer, and for the kidnappers, the real story, the story of the aftermath, the trauma, the hunt, and the curse of the blood money, was only just beginning. When Freddy Heineken and Ab Dotterer were pulled from that dark, cold shed on November 30th, 1983, the Netherlands breathed a collective sigh of relief. The king was free. The 21-day nightmare was over. The nation celebrated. But this was no fairy tale. The flashing cameras of the press, the cheers of relief, they were the end of the kidnapping, but they were the beginning of the aftermath. And the aftermath would be a different kind of prison, one that would last for the rest of their lives. The men who emerged from that shed were not the same men who had been taken. They were ghosts. They were men who had spent 504 hours in a soundproof box, chained to a wall, existing in a state of total, absolute powerlessness. The nation saw a rescue. But Freddy Heineken and especially Ab Dotterer were about to begin a life sentence. Freddy Heineken returned to his palace, but the palace had become a fortress. The man who had once reveled in his celebrity, who had sailed his yacht Something Cool with movie stars, who had driven through Amsterdam as if he owned it, which in many ways he did, was now a prisoner of his own wealth. The most immediate and visible change was the security. Fortress Heineken was born. His villa and the homes of his family and top executives were retrofitted with state-of-the-art security systems. Bulletproof glass, panic rooms, a phalanx of bodyguards recruited from the Dutch Special Forces now surrounded him 24 hours a day. He no longer traveled in a simple Mercedes. He traveled in an armored convoy, but the physical walls were nothing compared to the psychological ones. Freddy was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He was a man tormented. He suffered from crippling insomnia. He would later tell confidants that the silence of his opulent home was in some ways worse than the noise of the cell. The crushing absolute quiet of the soundproof box had been burned into his psyche. Any silence, he felt, was just a prelude to an attack. He had recurring nightmares. He would wake up in a cold sweat, back in the box, the clank of the chain, the hum of the extractor fan, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. The man who had once charmed rooms full of strangers now saw a potential threat in every new face. He became deeply, profoundly suspicious. His famous autocratic leadership style, once tempered with charisma, now hardened into something brittle and dark. He trusted no one. He would second-guess his closest lieutenants, pore over security reports with a paranoid intensity, and fly into rages over minor lapses. To cope, his brilliant mind created a defense mechanism. He would insist to his inner circle, "They didn't kidnap me. They kidnapped Mr. Heineken." This wasn't just a clever soundbite. It was a desperate act of psychological survival. He had to separate himself, Freddy the man, from the public symbol, the asset that had been targeted. He was trying to tell himself that the violation, the humiliation, the animalistic terror that had happened to the brand, not the person. But it was a lie. The brand was fine. The man was shattered. This trauma manifested as a burning, obsessive need for justice, but it felt more like vengeance. He didn't just want to recover, he wanted to hunt. He was a man who had regained his freedom, but not his control. The only way to get that control back, he felt, was to see the men who had done this to him found, captured, and punished. He poured his own money, his own vast resources and network into aiding the police hunt. He could not rest. He would not rest. For Freddy, the kidnapping hadn't ended on November 30th. It would only end when his captors were locked away. But this story has two victims. The world's cameras, its headlines, its entire focus was on Mr. Heineken. The billionaire king had returned. But what about the other man? What about Ab Doderer? This is perhaps the most heartbreaking and overlooked part of the entire saga. Ab Doderer was the collateral damage. He was not a tycoon. He was a driver, a 57-year-old working man, a loyal employee who had committed no sin other than showing up for his job. He was kidnapped for one reason. He was sitting next to the target. When Freddy returned to his fortress, Ab Doderer returned to his modest life. But he couldn't live it. He was, by all accounts, completely and irreversibly broken by the ordeal. He too suffered from crippling PTSD, but is manifested differently. Freddy's trauma turned to rage and obsession. Ab's turned to terror and retreat. He could never drive again. He couldn't be in a car. The sound of a backfire, a sudden stop in traffic, a door slamming, it would send him into a spiral of panic. He was terrified of loud noises. He was terrified of the dark. He was terrified of being alone. And here is the cruelest cut. He felt abandoned. While Mr. Heineken was the subject of national concern, Ab Doderer became the footnote. The Heineken company provided him with a pension, but financially he was ruined. He could never work. He was a man with no empire to distract him, no boardroom to command, no global strategy to obsess over. He had only his thoughts, and his thoughts were a torture chamber. His family would later speak of their bitterness. He was the forgotten man, the loyal servant who had been shattered in service to the king and then left to pick up the pieces of his own mind, a task that was, for him, impossible. Ab Doderer would spend the rest of his life in and out of psychiatric care, a man permanently destroyed by 21 days of terror. His tragedy is the human cost of the crime, the part that gets lost when the headlines are only about the millions of guilders. It serves as a stark, painful reminder that trauma doesn't care about your bank account. But your bank account and your fame dictates the world you return to. While Freddy and Ab wrestled with their demons, the hunt for the kidnappers and the money was on. This was not the perfect crime the gang had dreamed of. It was a chaotic, panicked dispersal. Operation Lagos, the police task force, now had a singular focus. They had leads, they had names, supplied by informants from the Amsterdam underworld who were feeling the immense police pressure. The first to fall were the builders, John Bullard and Martin Erkamps. They were arrested in the Netherlands within weeks. They were the muscle, the carpenters who had built the cells, but they weren't the masterminds. The masterminds, Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder, were smarter. They had their share of the cash, and they had a plan. They fled the country. With their millions, they drove south, making their way to Paris. They were, for a time, free. They were rich. They were fugitives, living the high life in France, believing they had gotten away with it. And what about the money? What about the 35 million guilders? This is where the story takes a turn for the darkly symbolic. The gang had split the cash, but they couldn't just walk around with 200 kilograms of it. In their panic, before they fled, they had taken a large portion of the ransom, millions upon millions, stuffed it into heavy-duty plastic barrels, driven to a forest near the town of Zeist, and buried it, a pirate's treasure. But someone talked. An anonymous tip, its source still debated, led police to that exact spot in the forest. They brought in digging equipment, and they found it. They unearthed the barrels, cracked the seals, and were met with a foul, overwhelming stench. The money was rotting. The barrels hadn't been watertight. Groundwater had seeped in. The millions of guilders were a sodden, mildewed, foul-smelling pulp. It was no longer a jackpot. It was refuse. The image that captivated the Netherlands was of police officers back at the station, painstakingly trying to dry out millions of guilders with hairdryers, laying the notes one by one on tables, trying to salvage the ransom. It was a perfect, almost biblical metaphor. This wasn't a ticket to paradise. This was blood money. And it was, quite literally, cursed. The police were able to recover a large portion of the ransom, but not all of it. Holleder and Van Hout had their share, and millions more simply vanished, laundered, spent, hidden in a labyrinth of real estate and shady business deals. It would go on to fund a new, far more violent chapter in the Dutch underworld. Back in Paris, the party was coming to an end. Cor Van Hout and Willem Holleder were living large, but they were also careless. The Dutch police, working with French intelligence, tracked them down. In February 1984, 3 months after the rescue, a French SWAT team kicked in the door of their luxury apartment, and the two masterminds were in custody. For Freddy Heineken back in his fortress, this should have been the moment of relief, the moment of closure. It was not. In a cruel twist of fate, it was the beginning of a new kind of psychological torture. The Netherlands immediately demanded their extradition, and France said no. This began one of the most bizarre and frustrating chapters of the entire saga. It became a protracted 2-year legal and diplomatic war. The kidnappers, now in a French prison, had hired a team of high-priced lawyers, and they began to fight the system. Their argument that the potential 20-year sentence they faced in the Netherlands was inhumane, that the conditions of their imprisonment would violate their human rights. French judges, part of a legal system notoriously resistant to extradition, were sympathetic. The case became a cause célèbre. So imagine Freddy Heineken's state of mind. He was a prisoner in his own home, crippled by PTSD, while his captors were sitting in a relatively comfortable French prison, giving interviews to the press, and successfully painting themselves as the victims of an overzealous legal system. It was a farce, a grotesque insult that rubbed salt in his very raw wounds. It denied him the one thing he craved, closure. It extended his trauma, making him feel once again completely powerless. The Dutch government was furious. It became a major diplomatic incident. For over 2 years, this legal battle raged. Finally, in October 1986, after immense political pressure, a deal was struck. France still refused to extradite them for the kidnapping itself. So the Dutch prosecutors used a workaround. They extradited them on a different related charge, violent extortion. It was a legal fig leaf, but it was enough. After nearly 3 years on the run or in French custody, Cor Van Hout and Willem Holleder were finally put on a plane and sent back to the Netherlands to face justice. The trial was a national sensation. The entire country was gripped, waiting for the hammer of justice to fall. The evidence, of course, was overwhelming. They had the testimony of the other gang members. They had the physical evidence from the warehouse. They had the rotting money. The guilt was not in doubt. The only question was the price. What is the price for 21 days of terror? What is the price for destroying Ab Doderer's life? What is the price for traumatizing a man so badly he would never be the same? The prosecution, echoing the public's fury, demanded the maximum. And then the verdict came down. Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder were sentenced to just 11 years in prison. The other members received similar or lesser sentences. The nation was stunned. 11 years for a crime that had held the country hostage. It was an outrage. The judges in their defense were operating under the laws of the time. Kidnapping, while serious, was not seen as the crime of the century it felt like. And with Dutch rules for good behavior and parole, it meant these men would likely be back on the streets in 7 or 8 years. For Freddy Heineken, this was the final, unforgivable betrayal. The police had found them, the prosecutors had tried them, and the system, his system, had failed him. It confirmed his darkest, most paranoid fears, that the world was a lawless place, that there was no real justice, and that, in the end, you were on your own. The light sentences were more than just an insult. They were a seed, a poison seed, because the men who went into that prison were not being rehabilitated. They were just waiting. They were networking, and they were planning. The kidnapping had given them money, yes, but it had also given them something far more valuable in their world: infamy. The trial was over, the men were in jail, but the story was far from finished. For Freddy, he now had to find a way to live, not just with the trauma, but with the injustice. And for the Dutch underworld, a new, far more dangerous era was about to be born, funded by Heineken's millions, and led by the very men who would soon be free to walk the streets of Amsterdam once more. The light sentences were a joke, but the 35 million guilder ransom was a curse. The gang's ringleader, Cor van Hout, was assassinated in 2003. But the most terrifying legacy was Willem Holleder. He used his fame and money to become the godfather of Amsterdam, a twisted national celebrity known as the cuddly criminal, while secretly running an extortion empire. His reign of terror only ended decades later when his own sister Astrid secretly recorded him, leading to his life sentence for orchestrating 5 murders. The blood money had finally claimed its last victim. The kidnapping also changed the Heineken family forever. Freddy, paranoid and suffering from PTSD, ruled like a wounded king, obsessed with security. His daughter, Charlene de Carvalho Heineken, who inherited the empire, learned a brutal lesson from his trauma. She became the anti-Freddy, intensely private, anonymous, and ruling not by charisma, but by structure. She saved the company by remaining in the shadows, proving that her father's fame had been a liability. The case marked an end of innocence for the Netherlands. It spawned books, films, and a 30-year true crime saga, a dark national obsession that began with one man chained in a cell and ended with his tormentor becoming a celebrity. In the end, after all the terror, the trauma, the trials, and the decades of dark tabloid fascination, what is the true legacy of the Heineken kidnapping? It is not one story, but 2, and they stand in stark, permanent, and powerful contrast to one another. On the one hand, there is the legacy of the kidnappers, the legacy of the 35 million guilders. It is a story of pure, corrosive self-destruction. The money that was meant to buy them a life of freedom turned out to be a curse, a poison that rotted from the inside out. It was blood money, and it demanded more. It led Cor van Hout to an early, violent grave, assassinated in a hail of bullets. It turned Willem Holleder from a common thug into a celebrity monster, a man so consumed by greed and paranoia that he tore his own family apart, landing him in a prison cell for the rest of his natural life. Their story is a grim Shakespearean tragedy of the modern age. It is a lesson in the emptiness of greed, They successfully stole the money, but they could never steal the wealth. They mistook the symbol for the substance, and it destroyed every single one of them. And then there is the other legacy, the legacy of the Heineken family. If the kidnapper's story is one of self-destruction, the family's is one of profound and profoundly quiet resilience. They endured, they survived, and ultimately they won. Not just by getting Freddy back, but by building an empire stronger and more vast than ever before. Today, Charlene de Carvalho Heineken, the woman who learned from her father's trauma that true power lies in privacy, presides over that empire. She is one of the wealthiest women on the planet. The company, under her steady, unseen guidance, has grown into a global behemoth, its value dwarfing anything her father could have imagined. The family, which the kidnappers tried to break, maintained their control, their unity, and their dignity. This is the great central contradiction of the entire story. The event that was designed to destroy the Heineken family, that traumatized its patriarch and exposed its greatest weakness, became the very catalyst for its survival. The kidnapping was the fiery crucible that forced the company to shed its 1970s, one-man show skin and evolve into the modern, resilient 21st century fortress it is today. Freddy Heineken, the charismatic showman, had built an empire on his personality. His daughter, the quiet strategist, saved it with her anonymity. This is not a story with a simple, happy ending. There is no triumph without cost. True resilience is not about being unbreakable. It's about how you rebuild. Freddy Heineken was never truly the same man. The psychological chains of those 21 days stayed with him until his death. And for Ab Dodderer, the loyal driver, the collateral damage, his life was a tragic, heartbreaking sacrifice. His story is a permanent, painful reminder of the true human cost of this crime, a cost that no ransom could ever cover. The Heineken kidnapping, in the end, is more than just a landmark true crime story. It is a multi-generational saga about wealth, family, and survival. It is about the profound difference between money and legacy. The kidnappers sought money, and it brought them only death and ruin. The Heineken family, faced with an unimaginable crisis, chose to protect their legacy. And that legacy, built not just on barley and yeast, but on a foundation of iron-willed endurance, proved to be the one thing that no one, no matter how brutal or how greedy, could ever steal.